around consumption, which basically is dependent, on the mall, not the more than the factory. If people don't have money, how are they going to buy? We've seen stories about like luxury goods are up, sort of thing, but we're not seeing that Main Street or High Street malls are doing that well, that I've seen anyway. So maybe my question is, how is this recovery, this magical recovery, is there a magic wand? Is it, going to happen just because we want it to?
Can I just say that the thing we now have to look at is something different from what we were looking at. What we started looking at was a crisis in the financial sector. What we're now looking at is the costs in different parts of the economy. And one of the biggest costs is in the public sector and public sector spending. And that's, if you're looking at what the long-term costs of this are going to be, that's what it's going to be. In the retrenchment there's going to have to be in the public sector in various ways to make up the huge deficits that have been built up rescuing the financial sector. So the longer-term costs, and I think the debate now really has to shift from the financial sector to who is going to pay the cost of this recovery in terms of how we're going to structure rebuilding the public finances who have been deeply damaged by this recession. And that's where I think the story, are we going to have less subsidy for education? Are we going to, how can the U.S. afford its healthcare reform in the midst of this crisis? How is the U.K. going to, raise taxes as well as cut public spending? And there are all sorts of issues there. And I think that's where this crisis, in a sense, has moved in terms of the economic story. It's now how we're going to share the costs. And, many of the choices that are being debated or not debated really are about how those costs are going to be distributed. And the costs are not just within countries, it's also this question of how those costs are going to be distributed between countries. The country with the reserve currency has some advantages in being able to put those costs out to other countries. Currencies are potentially a big issue in how the costs are distributed, and the issue, where's the recovery coming from? It's going to have to come from countries that have been the big debtors, like the UK and the US, exporting more at the cost of the current big exporters, China, Germany, and so forth, if there is going to be a recovery in those countries. That's the sort of tensions we're going to see in the next few years, in a sense.
Damien, you wanted to follow up on that?
Well, I agree with Steve about the kind of thinking about the knock-on effects in answer to this question about how the next part of this crisis is going to be reported. And I think looking back, one of the things that's come out of the discussion during the conference is that in covering the crisis, one of the key problems has been linking together different beats. In a sense, how the financial journalist manages to push this onto the front page. And looking back, although there are certain people who were identifying the risks in capital markets and particular products and credit default swaps and so forth, the Gillian Tetz, whilst there were some people making observations about these risks, those stories didn't translate across. And as the crisis unfolds, it moves from a financial story to a political story to a story about the knock-on effects in the general economy. And I think we're still dealing with those difficulties of read across, particularly where highly technical issues may be involved. But in terms of the things that the more general crisis of journalism and the economic problems journalism faces, we've intimated some potential problems. I think that financial and business journalists and journalism more generally really probably needs a bit of a wake-up call. And some of the more positive things which have come out of the discussion, for example, collaboration with bloggers, the network journalism model, you can get some investigations effectively outsourced. And there are sensitivities about parasitical relationships between bloggers and other content providers. Those things need to be ironed out. There needs to be an understanding of how those deals work. But I think also issues of collaborations with other experts. The big problem of missing the big picture, nobody getting the big picture, I think was an issue, and understanding how to make the case to editors about something which is highly technical. I mean, Wolfgang, you mentioned Willem Buiter. He's actually not your colleague, by the way, he's my colleague, at the London School of Economics. And this kind of linking with experts in academia and elsewhere, I think can be, in some senses, formalized, in some senses, more could be done with it in that sense, if there is a problem, a structural problem of newspapers and financial journalism more broadly not being able to afford the necessary expertise.
I have another question here. We'll come back to Bill.
Hi, actually, I've got a question that leads on directly to what you've just been saying, Damien. I like what you said about the dual face of financial journalism. What is it that financial journalists are supposed to do? Serve the trading purposes or act as a watchdog? Well, if we're going to assume that financial journalists will act as a watchdog, especially now in the times to come where there's a decline now or a decline in 2 years, especially if there's going to be a decline in 2 years, it's going to be even more necessary to have good journalism now. How will you address the middle? You know, if we've got the specialists on one side and then we've got the FT and we've got the IMF and we've got God knows what doing very intelligent work for those who read it, how will we address the middle, those people who read the Daily Mail in the UK or the Newsday in the US or Bild Zeitung in Germany or whatever? Can we really keep ignoring them if, you know, we're wanting them to read the stories about how this is going to affect healthcare, whatever? I mean, regardless, let me, go on.
I mean, my point is that the crisis makes abundantly clear that it's no longer a story which is just for one bit of the newspaper. It crosses over with personal finance, with political news, and citizens need to know. And
this is true, but
how get angry when they feel that they're not being told.
This is very true. They're not being told, but also, as we keep hearing everywhere, they just want to read the good news story because they're sick of hearing the bad news story. So isn't it time for people like you in academia and maybe editors to invest in really innovative stuff? Why not forget the highbrow journalism? Why not go for, you know, have more cartoonists like Cal, you know, to do stuff for the Daily Mail? Why not have things on little clips on YouTube? Why not have more films like Plunder? Why not make it much, much more mainstream and really sort of embrace it as a kind of not just educational but entertainment, provide entertainment with it, and that way reach the middle, which needs to be reached. Mm-hmm. And then I have one, sorry, I'm really sorry, but I have one more question on the collaboration. How will you do the collaboration when media is starting to eat itself? You read today's paper in the FT about Murdoch threatening to sue the BBC and Google for lifting content. Thank you.
Which bit do you want them to address first?
The one about the middle. The one about the
Okay.
middle. Nobody wants to do it.
If I can add on to the middle, and one thing I think we've neglected to discuss throughout of this, we're talking about what people will read. We talk about a lot about what will be on the front page. A lot of people are getting their news on television, whether we like it or not. And I covered the London Stock Exchange for many years, whereby I would have to go down there, and within my hourly report, I would probably cover 5 sectors, a little bit about the banking sector is up. We've seen a little bit of this and that and happen in the other one. We've got a little bit of activity in the oil. It's sort of the housing market's doing that. And oh, and by the way, it's Cadbury's results today as well. So let me tell you a little bit about chocolate and what's going on. So we had to become instant experts. And this is what television journalists have to do. They've also got to deliver with that great flair and that great bit of, as you say, maybe a little bit of entertainment. And there's the danger. I know it sort of goes back to, they used to say, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. Because, you know, you don't want to give too much information, and you can't give too much information. So I worry about what you say in one way, because it can't be too much infotainment, and I think television has gone down that road a little bit. But at the same time, how do you address it? Because this is where people are getting their news. They're not necessarily reading, but again, it's the middle ground. Do you want to follow on that?
I just want to very quick, because when I'm not talking about infotainment, I'm talking about the kind of entertainment provided by, I don't know whether you've ever seen the show, I don't even remember the name of it, but the two birds, you know, Bird and Bird, whatever they're called, the two guys who sit there and shoot the breeze about sorry.
Yeah. Bird and Fortune.
Well, there we go, Bird and Fortune. Well, they're brilliant. That's journalism, isn't it? And maybe something that we need to do more of.
Well, the most popular news show in the U.S. for people under 30 is
The
the
Daily Show.
Show.
Yeah.
Okay?
And Jon Stewart is now doing political
comedy.
or financial
Yeah, and
news.
this is a way of reaching people, because I think the reality is that the majority of the public is not reading specialist press and never will. And you're right, even in the internet age that we're seeing, where people might go to YouTube, the majority of information is conveyed to people through television, through the mass media. And I think it's very important that we don't lose that space and ignore that space. And indeed, if anything, what the